British Indian Army, an institution shaped over centuries under colonial rule, played a pivotal role during the Second World War. It emerged not just as a fighting force, but as a symbol of transformation in British India. From the sands of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, and from the mountains of Italy to the trenches of Europe, the Indian soldiers fought valiantly on battlefields across the world. Yet, while soldiers shed blood for the empire, their homeland was being swept by winds of change, calls for independence, political unrest, and demands for Indianization of state structures. This video explores the journey of the British Indian Army during the Second World War, focusing on its modernization, mechanization, Indianization, the growing nationalist consciousness, and the political complexities that shaped its destiny. On the eve of the Second World War, the British Indian Army was still primarily a colonial force. Comprised of nearly 200,000 soldiers, it was spread thin across the vast reaches of British India and the rest of the empire. This army, though hardened by decades of colonial skirmishes and campaigns, was antiquated in many ways, lacking modern equipment, motorized transport, and mechanized warfare capabilities. In 1939, the army of the British Raj in South Asia comprised about 130,000 men, in addition to about 44,000 men in British Indian units. Their mission was internal security and preparing for a possible Soviet advance into South Asia through Afghanistan. For decades, the army had been reliant on traditional infantry and cavalry regiments, supplemented by outdated artillery. There was a glaring lack of motor vehicles, radios, and the latest firearms. Transforming the cavalry force into a mechanized tank force had only just begun. It was held back by the inability to supply adequate numbers of armored vehicles. However, with the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939, this would change dramatically. The global nature of the Second World War forced the British Empire to look towards its colonial armies for manpower and resources. It was clear that the British Indian Army needed rapid modernization. The pre-war army was about to be transformed into a force capable of modern warfare. One of the most significant developments for the British Indian Army during the war was its mechanization and motorization. The army transitioned from its reliance on foot soldiers and horse-mounted cavalry to becoming a modern fighting force equipped with tanks, armored vehicles, and motorized transport. As the war progressed, the size and role of the Indian Army expanded dramatically, and troops were sent to battlefronts as soon as possible. The most serious problem was a lack of equipment. India's factories, which had been relatively underdeveloped before the war, were quickly repurposed for the war effort. They began churning out military vehicles, artillery, and ammunition at an unprecedented rate. With support from British and American manufacturers, Indian soldiers were equipped with Sherman tanks, Bren gun carriers, and a wide array of artillery pieces. Training camps across India buzzed with activity as Indian soldiers were taught to operate and maintain this new machinery. For many of them, this was their first encounter with modern technology on such a scale. The process was far from smooth, but the need for rapid mobilization during the war made it an imperative. The new mechanized Indian divisions were soon dispatched to various theaters of war. These units, now equipped with tanks, trucks, and anti-aircraft guns, played crucial roles in the battles of North Africa, Italy, and Burma. As the British Indian Army expanded, another transformation was quietly taking place: the Indianization of its officer corps. Historically, British officers had dominated the leadership of Indian regiments. The Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, were led by a predominantly British officer class. This reinforced the hierarchical structure of colonial rule. By the late 1930s, political pressures and the rising nationalist consciousness within India forced the British government to reconsider this arrangement. The creation of the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun in 1932 was a major step in training Indian officers. With the outbreak of war, this process accelerated. As the need for officers grew during the war, more Indian cadets were enrolled in officer training programs. By 1945, the British Indian Army had over 15,000 Indian officers. a significant shift from the pre-war period. However, this Indianization was not without its challenges. British officers often held deep racist feelings about their Indian counterparts. The caste and communal dynamics within Indian society also played a role in shaping perceptions of Indian officers. While the British Indian Army was modernizing on the battlefield, India itself was undergoing a political transformation. The 1930s and 1940s saw the rise of the Indian nationalist movement, spearheaded by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. The Indian National Congress, representing the aspirations of millions of Indians, demanded greater autonomy and ultimately complete independence from British rule. But the war complicated matters. India's political leaders were deeply divided on whether to support the British war effort. Gandhi called for non-violence and non-cooperation, while others, like Subhash Chandra Bose, advocated for an armed struggle against the British, even aligning with Axis powers. In 1942, the Quit India movement was launched, leading to widespread protests, arrests, and political repression across the country. On the other hand, the Muslim League, under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, saw the war as an opportunity to push for Muslim representation in the army and in broader politics. The communal question, the issue of whether India's Muslims and Hindus could coexist in a single nation, became a key factor in recruitment. The British, mindful of these divisions, made concerted efforts to recruit soldiers from Muslim-majority regions like Punjab, Balochistan, and the Northwest Frontier Province. The result was a complicated political landscape. While Indian soldiers were sent to fight on behalf of the empire, political tensions in India simmered. The army itself, once a symbol of colonial control, was becoming a battleground for competing visions of India's future. While political turmoil engulfed India, the soldiers of the British Indian Army were engaged in brutal fighting across multiple theatres of war. In North Africa, Indian divisions were key participants in the campaigns against Rommel's Afrika Corps. They fought in harsh desert conditions, proving their mettle in battles such as El Alamein and Tobruk. In Italy, Indian soldiers were involved in some of the most grueling combat of the war. They scaled the rugged Apennine Mountains, participated in the bloody battles of Monte Cassino, and helped break through the German defensive lines. But perhaps the most iconic and challenging campaign for Indian soldiers was the Burma campaign. The dense jungles, tropical diseases, and ferocious Japanese advance made it one of the most difficult fronts of the war. With the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in 1942, about 40,000 Indian soldiers were captured. They were given a choice. 30,000 joined the pro-Japanese Indian National Army, led by Subhash Chandra Bose. Those who refused became POWs, but mostly shipped to New Guinea. Indian soldiers fought alongside British and Commonwealth troops in what became a turning point of the war in the East. The battles of Impahal and Kohima are remembered as some of the fiercest, where Indian soldiers displayed a decisive role in halting the Japanese invasion of India. For many Indian soldiers, the battlefield was a place of unimaginable hardship. They faced not only the enemy, but also the challenges of extreme climates, insufficient supplies, and long separations from their families back home. Despite this, the bravery and sacrifice of Indian soldiers was widely recognized. Over 2.5 million Indians served in the British Indian Army during the war, making it the largest volunteer force in the world. By the end of the Second World War, the British Indian Army had transformed into a highly modern and mechanized force. But the war had also fundamentally changed India's political landscape. The experience of Indian soldiers fighting for the British Empire while nationalist leaders called for freedom deepened the contradictions of colonial rule. In the years following the war, India would gain its independence. The army that had once been a symbol of British power would become a cornerstone of the new Indian and Pakistani states after the partition in 1947. For many veterans of the war, their service in the British Indian Army became a source of both pride and complexity. They had fought for an empire that no longer existed, and for a homeland that had been divided. It was a force that underwent rapid modernization, embraced mechanization, and saw the Indianization of its leadership. It was also an army caught in the crosswinds of political change, a colonial army in a nation on the cusp of independence. The soldiers of the British Indian Army fought with courage across the world, and their stories are etched in the annals of history. Yet, their legacy is also a reminder of the realities of colonialism, nationalism, and the struggles for independence. Western mass media is only now beginning to come to terms with how it overlooked the armies and soldiers of the Raj. Most traditional depictions of British troops in the war have entirely ignored colonial troops, even though wartime accounts and memoirs speak of these troops in most of the important British campaigns. The victories of British arms in the Second World War were owed in no small part to the reliable and competent soldiers of the Raj. These men and women sincerely devoted themselves to the fight against the global fascist Axis, even though their own lands had been conquered and ruled with colonial violence. Britain's colonial rule inspired Hitler himself in his dreams of how to handle those he saw as inferior races. Yet, despite their subordinate status in the globe-spanning British Empire, few soldiers of the Raj actually defected to the Axis side, despite propaganda urging them to do so. Millions of troops from South Asia made the victory of the Allied side possible. The technical skill and military confidence acquired by these troops became the basis for the powerful armed forces of India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh. The British Indian Army, forged in the fires of history's most bloody war, left behind a legacy that would shape the future of South Asia and the world.